Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Heavy Horses by the band Jethro Tull.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
These are Jethro Tull. I think we've encountered them 3 times by now, which probably makes them the first band on this series to have been encountered 4 times throughout the list so far, which is definitely a feat to remember. Anyway, here's some of my favorite bits from this album. So I don't know if it's just me, but it seems like recently the list has been giving us more and more of the later 70s albums, the mid 70s albums, and even some 80s albums. And personally, I'm really enjoying those. When I started this series off, I basically knew almost everything about prog from the early 70s, and I really didn't know anything about what came later on. So one of my subconscious expectations towards this series was to get to know more of prog from the later era of the 70s and onwards, and now at this point I can definitely say that what I know from this era is still quite good, although we do start seeing some really bad stuff coming along as well. And today's album is of course one of those albums that came out in the later 70s, but this one came out by a major band. Of course, this is 1978's Heavy Horses by no other than Jethro Tull. Now, by many this one is considered to be Jethro Tull's last great albums, and from here on out we see albums that mostly show a decline in the band's popularity. And this album today is also considered to be the second installment of the last folk rock Jethro Tull trilogy, starting in 1977 with Songs from the Wood, then following it up with Heavy Horses, and ending in 1979's Stormwatch, which we've already reviewed on the series. And the reasons that these 3 are considered to be some sort of a trilogy is because they consist of folk rock music. Now notice I didn't say folk prog, I said folk rock. We definitely see Jethro Tull leaving some of their progressive tendencies in order to pursue more rocky music, but yet again never really forgetting about their folk influences. So while you might not find compositions like those of Thick as a Brick or Aqualung, you can still see a lot of very familiar stuff found on here as well. So much like of Jethro Tull's albums, this one is of course spearheaded by frontman Ian Anderson, both thematically and compositionally, and this one is very much inspired by rural lifestyle. You see, just before actually recording and starting to make this album, Ian Anderson acquired a country estate in Buckinghamshire and started living there. And this album really tries to capture that English countryside feeling, and it is even more prominently featured in the dedication for this album, which is, and I quote, dedicated to all the indigenous working ponies and horses of Great Britain. Now alongside all of this, this album was also the first Jethro Tull album to be recorded in Ian Anderson's own studio, which is in Fulham, London. And the band would later recall that Anderson specifically wanted to record this album during nighttime because during the daytime he wanted to rent the studio for other musicians. So a typical schedule for recording Heavy Horses usually started off at 7 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. the day after. Now, much like all of Jethro Tull's albums, we see writing credits for Ian Anderson on basically each and every single track on here, but this one is kinda special like Songs from the Wood, in which it also features some more composition credits. So we have Martin Barre that is credited for writing sections of No Lullaby and the title track of Heavy Horses, and we also have Dee Palmer, Love You Sis, who wrote the bridge on And the Mouse Police Never Sleeps and also made plenty of the violin arrangements for this entire album. Now this album also saw the beginning of Jethro Tull's probably most unfortunate saga, and that's the development of Ian Anderson chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, also known as COPD. And this disease is usually characterized by the obstruction of airflow through the lungs and to the throat, and is usually caused by heavy smoking. But with Ian Anderson's case, we have an interesting case of him straining his vocal cords and his ability through singing, and thus making this one develop much more quickly. And while he was advised back then to lay off his vocal cords, not sing as much and just take a rest from the entire vocal career as a whole, he unfortunately didn't do that and suffered the consequences, which would unfortunately lead him down a path of recovery that would never fully heal in the years to come. And we can already get some signs of this harsh and restrained voice in some of the songs on this album, mainly speaking on the title track. So yeah, that's basically the background for Heavy Horses. Now I believe it is time for us to actually talk about what's to be found on this album and what do I personally think about it. So as I said in the beginning, this album is considered the last one of a great Jethro Tull era. But why is that? Well, as I already noted, the fact is that these guys have started leaving off the progressive side of things in favor of doing things more traditionally rockier and still maintaining their original folk roots. And we've already seen this happen in prior Jethro Tull albums such as Were a Child and Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. And it seems that despite leaving their progressive aspects and putting them on the side burner for a while, people still love this album quite a bit, and that makes a bunch of sense because Jethro Tull in its essence is an English band that talks and speaks to English people. With its influences coming from traditional English folklore, you can definitely see how people still love their sound even if it wasn't as progressive. So while Jethro Tull have never been as proggy as their 1971 to 1975 run, it still does feature a sound on here that is highly reminiscent of their beginnings. And we get to see how great songs on this album can actually be even if they're not consisting for prog, and we see that with songs like Acres Wild or One Brown Mouse, or my personal favorite from the album being Moss. I kinda said it weird, I said it like moss, like the thing that grows on trees. I didn't mean that, I meant moths. The thing that flies and dies inside of books. And a large part of why I actually really like this album is a reason that I already gave a few days ago when I reviewed UK's second album being Danger Money. I love the fact that a band knows how to embrace their old progressive tendencies while also keeping up with the times and doing what's right at the moment, and this combination of both prog music and contemporary music, when done right, can sound really good, and that's definitely the case with this album. But the progressive aspect of this album isn't entirely lost on here, and I do personally believe that we get two tracks on here that do consist for prog. These ones of course being the title track of Heavy Horses and the other longest track on this album being No Lullaby. Despite being the third track on this album, I do believe that No Lullaby is the real one to set the tone for what's to come on here. Despite the rest not being as progressive, it does feature a lot of the key elements that makes this album so good, and that's of course all the playing of the band as well as the violin and orchestral arrangements, as well as just the unique tones and ever-shifting pace of music that's found on here, which honestly makes this one just a festival of sound. So as a listen from front to back, this is a great album, very fun. Maybe as I said countless times in this review, it might not be the most progressive, but that doesn't mean that it's not good. And personally, when I look at this one and look at Stormwatch and Songs from the Wood, I do believe that all of them are reminiscent of one another, and if you enjoy one, you're most likely gonna enjoy the rest, although I would admit that Stormwatch watch kind of left the folk aspect aside for a bit, so I can see why that would be a turn off for some people. But in my personal opinion, I'd like to thank all the indigenous working ponies and horses of Great Britain, and of course like to thank Jethro Tull for giving us this one last glimpse of greatness before dozing off into the 80s, of course. But yeah, with that being said, let's now talk about this album's cover. So before I get to talking about this album's cover, please answer me this one question. Isn't this the perfectest man you've ever seen? He looks so good on here. I'm just joking, of course, but gosh, do I love the persona that Ian Anderson has built around himself. And this photo was of course taken from the photo shoot for today's cover. Now personally, I do believe that I have some mixed feelings towards this album cover, because on the one hand it does look very good, but on the other hand it is a bit crowded. We have the sort of embroidery or interesting border going on the top of it, and we also have the very savvy text as well as the paragraph downwards and a very eventful image as well. But taking them all together, they just kind of work for some reason, and I don't really know why, but my assumption is as follows. I do believe that the main point of aspect of this album is actually the image to be found on it. Just think of this for a moment, close your eyes and try to envision what this cover actually looks like, and you're gonna see right away that the first image that pops into mind is Ian Anderson walking the two Clydesdale horses, and not more than that. And I do believe that if a new remastered version of this album would come out and only featured this image of Ian Anderson and nothing more than that, we would still remember and know that this is the same cover. Because the main point of aspect here is not all that's around, it's actually just Ian Anderson and the ponies. So as I said, this is a mixed one because it looks good but maybe wasn't done in the best way. It is kind of overcrowded and going a bit over the top, but at the same time it gets the job done quite correctly. So I'll give it a pass, but I do think they could have done a better job at it. So this is generally a great album whose only downside is of course the lack of progressive elements on it, but as a whole I would still give this one a very fine rating of 8 out of 10. But that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Star Castle by Starcastle. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wanham, Rist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description. Oops, I forgot to do down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.